Well, talking to people in Tokyo, the really there's a stark difference between what foreigners believe and what Japanese friends of mine believe. I feel a really strong sense from talking to Japanese on the ground in Tokyo that they're not going anywhere. They don't feel any need to flee. Whereas I know plenty of foreigners who've packed their families up and sent them overseas or to other parts of Japan. We saw today that the hotels in Osaka are fully booked, presumably with foreigners, foreign executives trying to get away from the radiation. What I think is fascinating and revelatory about this particular crisis is, like Katrina in the US, these sort of twin disasters have exposed issues, differences in the way Japan deals with things from other countries. And one of those, I think, most importantly around this radiation and nuclear issue is transparency and the differing attitudes between Japan and other countries on disclosure in a situation like this. Tokyo Electric Power doesn't have the greatest track record for disclosure. There are lots of Japanese companies that have problems with disclosure, and that has become an issue, it would seem, this time around. That said, events like this can prove to be turning points for issues like disclosure. If the Japanese public feels they're not getting enough news, if they're not getting enough information, if they feel unsafe, they'll put a lot of pressure on the government, which will then in turn put pressure on TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power. So I do think this will be a turning point for Japan for lots of reasons. One of them is around information disclosure. One of the key things to know about Japan going into this is that the government of Naoto Kan was weak, unpopular, and presided over a deeply divided parliament. So in addition, Japan, I believe, had kind of lost its way and lost a sense of its own identity. So if we look at the political, economic effects, short and long term, one of the first ones is really a test of whether the Kan government, and for that matter, any government of the Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ, can be trusted to guide the country through a serious crisis. And that is, this issue of trust in politicians, in the administration, was an issue before, and it is even more of an issue now when we're dealing with issues of life and death on a daily basis. So if the Kan government is able to survive and handle this well, then I think we would have a more balanced two-party system in Japan, where it's not just the LDP for decades and then the DPJ for a couple of years. It's a more fair competition. That's one of the effects. One of the other, I think, more psychological effects is that this crisis has provided an opportunity for Japan to think about itself in a different light. And by thinking about itself, I think that sort of like the UK for a while, Japan had lost a sense of its own identity. The rise of China and Japan slipping in the ranks economically had convinced a lot of Japanese people that their country really was in a downward spiral. And talking to Japanese people regularly, it was difficult to get people to say something positive about their country. While it's always a challenge to see a silver lining in a crisis as large and devastating as this one, I do think that we can look towards people thinking of Japan in a different light. And I mean Japanese people looking at how their country handled a crisis and how they came together as a nation, but also the rest of the world, because one of the positive aspects, if we can say that about this, is that over the last week, the world has paid more attention to Japan, its economy, its society, than it has in the last dozen years combined. And Japan, off the radar screen for several years now, is now very much in the minds of policymakers outside of Japan and in Asia and the US and Europe. So I think that could be a positive in terms of perhaps foreign direct investment, in terms of relations with China, where we had seen a surprising amount of sympathy online. There are a number of reasons to think that there are positive aspects that we could draw out of what is otherwise a devastating crisis. The area that was hit most powerfully by the quake and then the tsunami, Tohoku, has historically been an area that has been left behind economically in Japan. There are 6 prefectures. As a group, Tohoku, it produces the smallest contribution to Japan's GDP of any region except the northernmost island of Hokkaido. I believe this crisis will provide an opportunity to look again at Tohoku as Japan sets out to rebuild. Iwate Prefecture in particular has really fallen behind. Miyagi Prefecture as well will be a focus of these rebuilding efforts. And I believe as we have a DPJ government in power, assuming we continue to do that, that perhaps there'll be an opportunity to think differently about rural development, which has not been a focus of the increasingly urbanized Japanese polity. So from that perspective, Tohoku clearly is going to be a focus economically going forward. The costs of rebuilding will be enormous, but then Japan, because it has all of these domestic bondholders, should be relatively well prepared in the context of the Japanese economy to fund that. So the hit, as economists have pointed out, will obviously take a hit on the Japanese economy, but long term, I think there are positive aspects we can think about, not just Tohoku as a region, but say a rethinking of the way Japan approaches development of different regions outside Tokyo and Osaka.